This week, I'm going to show you over 10 different ways you could use bolsters in your yin yoga practice. Yin yoga is often a bit different from dynamic practices, and there's more time to look for your bolsters. So if you're new to yin yoga, then this video might help you to figure out different ways to use bolsters. Let's get started. So often when I teach yin yoga and there are new people in the class, I can see that if they are not used to using bolsters, they might feel a bit lost in the different ways that we can use bolsters. And there are so many different ways we can use bolsters in yin yoga, especially because there's so much time and space to reach for more props. So in this video, I just want to show you some ways that we can use bolsters in poses like the Swan, Savasana, Child's Pose, Twists, for example, as these are poses that in a more dynamic practice we might often do without any props. Just sometimes for that simple reason that there's no time to reach for props because we only stay in the pose for, let's say, 5 breaths. But when in yin practice, we stay in the pose for several minutes, the props and I think especially bolsters can really ease the pose and ease the practice if the poses feel really intense. We're going to start from the ultimate resting pose, Savasana pose. And there are a couple of different ways you could use bolsters. I have 2 bolsters with me today. So I'm going to show you how you could use 1 bolster, or if you have 2 bolsters, how you could use multiple bolsters. And we're going to start with Savasana pose. And this is maybe the most basic way of using a bolster in Savasana to bring it under the legs. And it might ease tension in the lower back. It might ease tension around the hips if you have something under the knees, under the thighs. So that might be quite a nice way to take the edge off your Savasana pose. Then another quite popular way is to use a bolster, especially if you have a heavier bolster, to bring it on top of the pelvis, just to kind of weigh the pelvis down. Or sometimes I see people turning the bolster lengthwise on top of the body. So just giving some extra weight, extra feedback on top of the body. Maybe even giving your bolster a hug. So those are 2 ways that we could use bolsters in Savasana pose. And then let's move into Child's Pose. So often in a faster, more dynamic practice, Child's Pose is a kind of in-between resting pose. But now in our yin practice, we're going to have lots more time in Child's Pose. And quite a nice way to use bolster would be under your belly, under your chest. So having a bolster kind of lengthwise in front of you and then leaning chest, leaning head onto that bolster. Again, if you have multiple bolsters, you might pile them on top of each other. Maybe you have them lengthwise there again. Or you might also turn them so that one is sideways, one is lengthwise. So it takes the bolster into kind of an angle, and that might make it really nice, a restful child's pose. If you have issues in knees or hips or ankles, another quite nice way to use the bolster in child's pose would be to bring it under the pelvis so that you're kind of sitting on top of the bolster, and that might take the edge off your knees or hips, and it also takes the extra weight and pressure off your ankles, your feet. So that might be another quite nice way to use a bolster in child's pose. Then let's move on to the Swan Pose, or as you might know, Swan Pose in a more dynamic practice as the pigeon. Now, when we do pigeon in yin, we call it swan. So it's a slightly different bird, and there are lots of different ways you could use your bolsters for your Swan Pose. I'll show you a few different ones. So one way, let's start with this. You put your bolster sideways onto the mat, and then you're going to bring that front leg over the bolster, and then when you lower the pelvis down, your bolster is kind of sideways under the pelvis. Now it could be under your buttocks, could be more under that front leg thigh, but it's taking pressure off the front leg knee, and sometimes this might make the pose more gentle, but to be honest, I think this actually makes the pose a bit more intense, at least for me. So we might use props as a way to make poses easier or more gentle, and sometimes we might use them in a way that makes them more intense. So having it there under the pelvis, kind of between the legs, might help with your Swan Pose. For some people that doesn't really work with the hips, so then, let's see, I'll turn the other way around so you can see. You could also just have the bolster on the side and then kind of lean that front leg hip onto it. So it's not between my legs, it's just in a similar way that you would use a block in the pigeon. The bolster is there, but the bolster is a bit softer, so it has a bit more give. It might be a bit more gentle prop than a block would be. But in a similar way, now I just have my right buttock, my right thigh leaning onto the bolster. So those might be ways to use the bolster under the pelvis. And quite many people I've seen in yin yoga practices actually like to use the bolster in a similar way as I just showed in the child's pose. So bring a bolster under the belly or under the chest, and then lean the upper body onto the bolster. And it takes pressure off your shoulders. You don't need to lean onto your arms, but you can lean the weight through the chest, through the belly. So those are 3 different ways you could use bolsters in your swan, which is the yin pigeon. Then let's move into seated forward bends. Now we have many different seated forward bends, but you could use bolsters in these similar ways for all of them. And one way is that you bring a bolster under your pelvis. So again, just like you would when you go in, just like you would use a block when you go into forward bends, but rather than sitting on a hard block, you could sit on the edge of a bolster. And what that does often helps us to tilt the pelvis forward a bit. So it could be that you have your legs crossed, you might have your legs in front of you, maybe you're doing a butterfly pose. In all of these, the bolster tilts your pelvis a bit forward, so when you lean then your back forward, it might be that it helps your pelvis to go forward as well. So that's one way. Another way is we could use bolsters under the knees. And again, it could be a butterfly shape. It could be that you have the legs in front of you, but just having that bolster under the knees or under the thighs might help some people when the knees can be bent in a supported way. Also, for some hypermobile people, if the knees bend, kind of extend too much, or maybe they need this to push the pelvis back a bit to get some rounding in the spine, whatever the reason is, for some people, having something under the knees makes the forward bend more accessible, maybe more comfortable. And again, you could use these as, if you have one bolster, you could use these as kind of sole ways of using a bolster, or you could combine them. The last thing that I would show for a seated forward bend would be to have a bolster in front of you. Again, just like in that swan and child's pose, having it for your chest, for your belly, for your head, but you lean your upper body onto the bolster again, so that you don't need to support with your arms, you don't need to lean onto your elbows, but you could just release the weight onto the bolster. And if you have a lot of tension in the neck and the upper back, then just having something under the head might be might make a very big difference in your forward bend when there's something supporting the neck, supporting the heavy head as you lean forward. So those are some ways that you could use bolsters for a forward bend. Let's move on to the next one, and that would be a twist. So we're going to finish off with the twist. And here again, I'm going to show you different ways. And one way would be, so we're now talking of a reclining, so lying down twist. And let me turn the other way so you can see better. So I am coming into my reclining twist. So reclining twist, this one, where we bring legs to one side and we have the chest open up to the ceiling. Now, it might be quite nice to use a bolster under your legs. So you lean your legs onto that bolster. Or, especially if you feel pain in the hips, in the lower back, maybe having the bolster between the legs takes that edge off. So that might create space around the pelvic area. If you have a heavy bolster, now I don't have a heavy bolster here, but if you have a heavy bolster, you could put it on top of the legs. This, in the past at least, has been quite popular in my classes to have extra weight on top of the legs. It doesn't always work if you have a very light bolster, like this is more like a cushion. But if you have a heavier bolster, there's really, on top of the legs, the bolster can really let the legs, the hips, the whole lower body ground down. So those would be different ways to use a bolster in a twist. Now, if you have different ideas, different ways to use bolsters in your yin yoga practice, or maybe other styles of yoga practices, any yoga practice, these are just a few examples. There are many, maybe tens or hundreds of different ways to use bolsters. I would really love to hear how you like to use your bolsters. So share in the comments below or send me a message. This way we can share our practices with everyone else. Thank you very much for joining in this video. If you liked it, please give the video a thumbs up and also leave your comments below, send me messages and share the video with anyone who you think might need some ideas in their yoga practice. Thank you again and I'll see you on the next video. Bye!